Elder Saul told the whole lodge I was abundant and alone. Everyone just stared at their salads. I left, dropped an envelope with 18 months of receipts on his altar, and walked out. No one stopped me. Good. I always knew it was going to end badly. I just didn't know it would happen that night. My name is Mira Dalton. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. At least, I used to. Before everything blew up at the Sanctum. It was a crisp November evening at the Mountain Lodge where the Sanctum of Balance held their monthly gratitude feasts. The place was rustic on purpose, plaid tablecloths, wood smoke in the air, homemade candles dripping wax down mason jars. Everyone was already seated at the long banquet table, their plates piled high with roasted squash, wild rice, and herbal breads. I found my spot near the middle, a little name card with Mira, blessing of abundance, scrawled across it in gold ink. I smiled awkwardly and sat down, adjusting the heavy linen scarf Elder Saul had once gifted me as a symbol of rootedness. Across from me, a woman named Juniper raised her glass. To Mira, she said loudly, grinning, our most generous spirit. The whole table turned toward me, clapping politely. I felt my cheeks burn. Saul stood up, holding his chipped clay mug like a preacher about to bless the congregation. Let's acknowledge Myra's incredible offering tonight, he said, voice deep and warm. $1,240 worth of sacred mushrooms and handmade oils, all gifted freely to the circle. Everyone clapped again, louder this time. A few people murmured, such abundance and true flow, like they were quoting a sacred text. I tried to smile. I really did, but something in my stomach twisted. I didn't want this much attention. I just wanted to feel like I belonged. Saul set down his mug and looked right at me, eyes twinkling with what he probably thought was wisdom. Mira doesn't mind, he said, chuckling. She's abundant and alone. It was like the air got sucked out of the room. The laughter died. Forks clinked against plates. A few people shifted in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their salads. I felt it hit me, sharp and cold. I tried to tell myself it was just a joke, a clumsy old man's attempt at humor, but I knew better. That wasn't a slip. That was a reminder, a warning. I pushed back my chair, the leg scraping against the old wooden floor louder than I intended. Excuse me, I said, my voice tight. No one stopped me. No one even reached out. They just watched as I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair and headed for the door. Outside, the night air slapped my face, raw and cold. I didn't pause. I didn't look back at the lodge's flickering windows. I just kept walking. Down the winding gravel driveway, past the prayer garden full of half-dead herbs, past the wooden gate carved with the words, in gratitude, we are one. I shoved it open and walked through, the old hinges groaning. Once the gate clicked shut behind me, I didn't stop. Not for a long time. The walk back to town took over an hour, but I barely noticed. My feet hurt, sure, but my thoughts were louder than the ache. By the time I got home, I'd already replayed Saul's words a dozen times in my head. Abundant and alone. Like my whole identity was a footnote to my bank account. Like being generous somehow made me less human. I curled up on my old thrift store couch, still wearing the coat I left in. I stared at the wall for a long time, and then the memories started creeping back. Before all this, before the oils and the mushrooms, before I became the Sanctum's golden goose, there was a time when they barely noticed me. I'd show up to their moon circles with little mason jars of foraged tea blends, tucked into a woven basket like something out of a fairy tale. No one ever said thank you. Half the time, people didn't even touch them. I remember one summer solstice potluck where I brought hand-rolled lavender truffles made with coconut milk and flower essences. I overheard someone whisper that they were too earthy. They all flocked to the store-bought baklava someone brought instead. I left with the whole tin still full. Back then, I was just Mira who makes weird tea. People smiled politely but never invited me to their private gatherings or fire circles. I wasn't part of the inner current, as Saul called it. Everything changed the moment one of my tincture videos went viral on Instagram. It was a short clip, me in my little kitchen, mixing rose elixir with ashwagandha, explaining its grounding properties. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it blew up. People started messaging me. Orders poured in. I had to stop taking DMs altogether. And just like that, the Sanctum changed its tune. Suddenly, I was Mira the alchemist. Mira the channel of bounty. People wanted to sit next to me at gatherings. I was invited to inner current retreats, offered speaking slots at the Equinox campouts. Saul even asked me to bless the harvest table one month. At first, it felt good. I won't lie. After years of being invisible, I soaked up the attention like a houseplant finally getting sunlight. But the ask started almost immediately. Could I sponsor travel for a new apprentice? Could I donate product for the winter gifting circle? Could I cover the cost of bulk chia for the ceremonial porridge? And they never called it what it was, money. It was always tithes or reciprocity or energetic support. Language that made it sound like a choice. But it wasn't. Not really. I'd grown up Catholic. I knew the shape of guilt dressed as holiness. The Sanctum just used different words. Nothing formal. Just a beat-up composition book I stuck under the counter in my kitchen. Every time someone from the Sanctum asked for something, I jotted it down. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. I just needed to see it, to make it real. Sponsor 2 for the Desert Vision Quest, $600. Saul's Son Legal Fund, $275. Ropes for Spring Ceremony, $180. Moon Cabin Heater Repair, $430. The requests were always wrapped in pretty language. Like when Willow asked if I could help restore warmth to the sacred dwelling in the dead of January, she meant the retreat cabin's busted heater. But she made it sound like I was donating to a spiritual furnace instead of just fixing an old propane line. Or when Laurel handed me a handmade charm with a crooked smile and said, "This is for your generosity, woven during Mercury's retrograde for protection." It was made of string and a button. I thanked her, even smiled. But that same night, I saw the other women comparing the gemstone mala beads they received from the same circle, all ordered from the same upscale Etsy shop, the ones I paid for. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at that little charm in my hand, and feeling like I was 10 years old again, getting a sticker from Sunday school while the boys got real Bibles. It wasn't the gift, it was the message. You are valuable, but only if you give. That realization made me sick, but I still didn't stop. Not then, because the sanctum was more than just a group. It had become my family, the one I never really had, the one that smiled at me, that said they saw me. So when they said things like, "Your essence uplifts the circle," I clung to that, even as my bank account thinned out like old soap. The worst was when I tried to skip a retreat. It was a full moon in April. My throat was raw, my car needed brakes, and I just didn't have it in me. I texted Saul, apologizing. He replied, "Your absence disturbs the current. You are an anchor in our energetic field." An anchor. I read the message 3 times, then stared at the ceiling and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was too perfect. Anchors don't get to float away. They just sink quietly and keep the ship from moving. A week later, I found myself back near the lodge. Not on purpose. At least, that's what I told myself when I realized I had taken the mountain road, the one that curved past the old wooden gates of the sanctum. The place looked the same, pine smoke curling from the chimney, prayer flags fluttering in the cold spring breeze. But there was something different too, something hollow. I slowed the car without meaning to, just enough to see it. In the center of the courtyard, where the gratitude circles were usually held, someone had laid out a new cushion, pale gold, embroidered with vines. And stitched across the top, in big thread-heavy letters, was one word, Mira. My stomach twisted. It wasn't love. It wasn't honor. It was a memorial to a wallet that had stopped walking through their door. I pressed the gas harder, speeding past the gate. But 20 minutes later, I was parked at the overlook on Cedar Ridge, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I stared down at the green patchwork of fields, the winding creek, the tiny glint of the lodge roof in the distance. And before I could talk myself out of it, I turned the car around. The sanctum was hosting a new moon gathering that night. I knew it without checking. New moons were always a big deal, intention setting, cord cutting, emotional renewal. Funny, considering how good they were at tying knots into people like me. I pulled up just as dusk was swallowing the mountains. No one saw me at first. They were all seated in the main hall, candles flickering around them, chanting low and soft. I stood just outside the open door for a second, watching. Elder Saul was in the center, holding a chunky clear quartz talisman in both hands. He lifted it slowly, eyes closed like he was channeling some sacred script. And when the Blessed One returns, he intoned, "We offer protection and forgiveness." I stepped over the threshold. The chanting died mid-syllable. Heads whipped around. Someone dropped a drumstick. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter. For a second, no one moved. Saul smiled, that greasy, saintly smile he saved for big moments. "Ah," he said warmly, like I was a lost cat finally home. "Mira, you felt the call." I didn't answer. I just walked slowly toward him, boots echoing off the worn pine floor. He extended the crystal toward me, both palms up. "Accept this blessing," he said, voice thick with fake kindness. "A new beginning. A cleansing of sorrow." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, not fancy, not gold embossed, just a regular, beat-up, white envelope, edges frayed from too many times being opened and checked. I held it out to him. Saul's smile faltered. His hands hovered awkwardly between the crystal and the envelope, like he couldn't figure out which reality he was supposed to be living in. I said quietly, "I'm offering something a little different tonight." The whole room watched in frozen silence. Saul took the envelope finally, holding it like it might bite him. Maybe it would. In a way, it already had. I stepped back, meeting the eyes of every single person who had once called me sister, anchor, spirit of abundance. Nobody smiled now. Good. I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch until it felt heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Saul cleared his throat, trying to summon the room back to his side. "Mira," he said slowly, holding the envelope like it was something sacred, "we can work through whatever pain you are carrying, but we must stay anchored in love." "Open it," I said. My voice wasn't loud. I didn't need it to be. The weight of it carried just fine. He hesitated. Of course he did. Saul didn't like things he couldn't control, but the attention of the room was already shifting. I could feel it, little sparks of doubt flickering in the crowd. He slipped a thick stack of papers from the envelope. The first page was simple. Itemized offerings, Mira Dalton, Sanctum of Balance, 18-month record. His eyes flicked across the page. I watched the color drain from his face as he took in the list. $1,240, retreat supplies, mushrooms, oils. $600, Vision Quest sponsorships. $275, legal fees for Saul Jr. $430, cabin heater replacement. $780, robes for initiate ceremony. $1,800, generator repair for fall gathering. $3,500, retreat center deposit. $2,000, emergency travel fund for Saul's personal sabbatical. And on and on. 18 months of financial bleeding, all wrapped up in flowery words about community and vibration and sacred flow. Someone in the back let out a small gasp. I stepped forward, slow and steady. You told me it was spiritual exchange. That every dollar was energy returning to the collective. But funny thing about real energy, it doesn't come with invoices and silent expectations. Saul lifted his head, trying to paste on a smile. These were voluntary offerings, he said, but his voice cracked right at the end. I looked at the group. Voluntary? Really? Then why was I told that skipping a retreat would disrupt the energy of the group? Why was I the only one expected to foot the bill when Saul's son needed a lawyer? No one spoke. I turned, pointing gently, not angrily, to a woman near the candles. Willow, you asked me to sponsor your vision quest because the universe would reward my generosity tenfold. Her face crumpled. She looked down at her lap. I pointed to another. Laurel, you handed me a handmade button charm and said that was enough thanks for the $300 in supplies you requested. Her hands twisted in her lap, the beads of her mala bracelet catching the light, beads I had paid for. Saul tried again, voice rising like a preacher in a tent. Mira, abundance flows through gratitude. You misunderstood the teachings. I turned back to him, feeling a strange, powerful calm settle over me. No, I said. You dressed transactions in linen robes and called it devotion. You called my loneliness an asset. You turned me into a walking tithe. The words landed hard. Nobody laughed. Nobody nodded. They just sat there, stunned, as if the whole reality they built together was suddenly tilting sideways. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a second envelope, this one even thinner, lighter. I placed it on the altar table in front of Saul, next to the burning sage. This, I said, is my final tithe. Inside that envelope were two things, a letter formally withdrawing my membership, and a cancellation of the standing donations they had automatically set up in my name. No more sacred funds. No more flowing generosity. Just, nothing. I stepped back, turned around, and walked out. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I didn't even look over my shoulder. The lodge door creaked shut behind me with a soft thud, and for the first time in months, I realized the mountain air didn't smell like guilt anymore. It just smelled like pine and smoke and freedom. The first few days after I walked out of the sanctum were quiet, too quiet. I kept waiting for someone to show up at my door with a bundle of sage and an apology, or at least a passive-aggressive text cloaked in faux spiritual language. But nothing came. I started to think maybe they were going to let it go. Maybe they'd just cut their losses and move on to the next person they could spin into a donor. I was wrong. On the fifth day, an official-looking envelope showed up in my mailbox. Thick paper. Embossed logo in the corner, Sanctum of Balance Legal Counsel. I sat on my porch steps, turning it over in my hands for a full minute before I opened it. Inside was a lawsuit. A real, honest-to-God lawsuit. They were suing me for communal abandonment, claiming I had inflicted irreparable energetic damage on the group by leaving without a proper closing ceremony. They listed damages, $2.3 million. I actually laughed out loud, sitting there on the steps, my breath fogging in the chilly morning air. $2.3 million. To cover energy disruption and disharmony inflicted on key members. They even cited brand disrepute, as if walking away from their commune had somehow torpedoed their spiritual reputation overnight. I flipped through the papers, stunned but also, weirdly amused. There was something liberating about it, in a twisted way. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't pretending this was about love or unity or sacred service. This was about money. It had always been about money. The gratitude, the abundance flows, the you are an anchor speeches. All of it was just marketing for free labor and endless donations. I set the papers down beside me and stared out at the line of trees along the road, their bare branches scratching the gray sky. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel scared. I felt free. Because now I had something worth fighting for. No more being the easygoing spirit everyone could guilt trip. No more mistaking their manipulation for belonging. They wanted a fight? Good. I picked up the papers, marched inside, and pulled out my laptop. I started a document labeled Sanctum Documentation and began listing everything I had: receipts, emails, donation records, old texts, screenshots. Everything they had ever said, implied, or demanded was about to be dragged into the light. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to show the world exactly what they were when the linen robes came off. And this time, there wouldn't be a candle circle big enough to cover it up. It was a Thursday when Lyra messaged me. I hadn't heard from her in almost a year. Not since she left the sanctum overnight. No explanation, no goodbye. Just vanished. Back then, everyone said she had outgrown the community. Saul even spun it into a lesson. Sometimes souls must ascend elsewhere. We must release them without bitterness. But I remembered the way Lyra used to sit next to me at the fires, her laughter too bright, her eyes too tired. I remembered the way she used to hold on to her cup of tea like it was the only thing anchoring her to the floor. Her message was short. Lyra, saw the lawsuit post. Can we meet? I have something you need. I stared at my phone, heart thudding. Something I need. We met at a little cafe in town, the kind that still played old Ella Fitzgerald songs and had chipped mugs that didn't match. I got there early, nervously stirring my coffee until it went cold. Then the bell above the door jingled, and there she was, smaller than I remembered, like the weight of the last year had been pressing down on her the whole time. She slid into the booth across from me without a word. For a second, we just sat there, staring at each other. Finally, she spoke. I'm sorry I left the way I did. I shook my head. You don't owe me an apology. She let out a breath, like she'd been holding it for months. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a battered folder. Inside were screenshots, old chat logs, recordings, evidence. Saul told me to cut ties with you, she said quietly. Said you were blocking my spiritual growth. That my evolution was being held back by your neediness. My stomach twisted. I remembered those months, the slow way Lyra had pulled back. The way she started answering texts with one-word responses. The way she smiled through gritted teeth at gatherings. It wasn't you, she said, pushing the folder toward me. They made it a condition for me to stay in the inner circle. Distance from you. Total separation. Her voice shook, but she didn't cry. Neither of us did. Maybe we were both too emptied out for tears. I opened the folder. There it was. Voice memos of Saul coaching Lyra on how to release attachments. Screenshots of Saul and the elders discussing managing Myra's emotional disruptions. Even a couple of emails where they casually called me a well of easy resources. It was worse than I thought. Way worse. I closed the folder slowly, feeling something settle deep inside me, not sadness, not rage, something harder, sharper. Lyra looked at me, her eyes wary. I'll testify if you need me to. I'll tell everything. I nodded once. I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. I planned. Because now I didn't just have my truth. I had proof. And I wasn't going to fight like they expected. I was going to burn their whole paper castle down. I didn't waste time. The very next morning, I emailed an old contact, Isla Tran, an independent journalist who once featured my herbal work in a piece about sustainable healing. She wasn't mainstream, but she had a loyal following. The kind that cared about real stories. Subject, sanctum of balance, financial and emotional abuse. When we met up later that week, I laid everything out. The receipts, the itemized lists, the screenshots from Lyra, the voice memos. I thought Isla might balk. That maybe it was too messy, too weird, too hard to explain to readers who didn't speak in energetic field and communal vibration buzzwords. But she didn't blink. People love to believe in magic, she said, flipping through the evidence, until they see where the money goes. 2 weeks later, the article dropped. Harvested, how a spiritual collective used one woman's wealth as divine currency. It exploded faster than I could have imagined. Screenshots from the piece started circulating immediately. Saul's emails, the well of easy resources comment, the breakdown of the $2.3 million lawsuit with its claims of energetic void damages. There were quotes from me, from Lyra, from 2 others who stepped forward once the story gained traction. Photos of the gratitude ceremonies where I was seated just off-center, never quite inside the circle. Receipts for equipment, trips, legal fees, all traced back to my bank account. And the audio clips? Saul's voice, calm and syrupy, coaching Lyra on cutting emotional parasites. Telling her that true spiritual growth sometimes requires pruning the branches that thirst too much. It was damning. Within days, sponsors started pulling out of sanctum retreats. Travel sites that had once partnered with them canceled their upcoming events. The newsletter, which used to preach about oneness and healing, went dead silent. And then, the real blow. Elder Saul announced he was stepping back indefinitely to reconnect with his divine essence. Which, in plain English, meant he was running. As for the lawsuit, gone, vanished without ceremony, like it had never existed. I received a terse email from a paralegal. The sanctum of balance hereby withdraws all claims against Mira Dalton. No further action will be pursued. No apology. No admission. But it didn't matter. Because they weren't just exposed. They were finished. I celebrated quietly. No champagne, no Instagram posts. Just a slow, deep exhale as I sat at my kitchen table. The same one where I'd once cried after writing another $1,000 check for communal tithes. I deleted every photo, every post, every trace of them from my accounts. Gone were the smiling selfies at moon circles. Gone were the quotes about abundance and divine reciprocity. Gone was the version of me who thought belonging had to be bought. Lyra came over that evening with takeout and 2 bottles of sparkling water. We didn't toast to vengeance. We didn't even say much about the sanctum. We just sat on the porch, plates balanced on our knees, watching the sunset smudge the mountains pink and gold. She bumped her shoulder against mine. So, what now? I smiled, real, wide, no bitterness bleeding through. Now, I said, I start over. That was about a year ago. Now, I live in a tiny coastal town called Port Arbor, tucked between the cliffs and the sea. It's the kind of place where the salt air sticks to your skin, and the gulls argue louder than the traffic. Exactly what I needed. No altar, no incense, no sage bundles tied with twine. Just my little herb shop off Main Street, a rented studio above it, and enough space to finally hear myself think. Lyra visits sometimes. She'll crash on the couch with a bag of pastries from the bakery down the block, and we'll watch old black and white movies, trading jokes and bad impressions. No labels, no ceremonies, just presence. We don't talk much about the sanctum anymore. It's not a ghost that follows me around. More like a scar, visible if you know where to look, but mostly forgotten unless the light hits it just right. I plant again, not for mass production, not for curated Instagram posts about abundance, just because it feels good to dig my hands into the dirt and smell something real. Chamomile, lemon balm, rosemary, rows of little green promises sprouting from mismatched pots behind the shop. Most mornings, I sit out back with a mug of coffee, barefoot on the cold wood deck, watching the mist roll off the ocean. I don't perform anymore. If I'm sad, I'm sad. If I'm happy, I'm happy. No one asks me to turn my feelings into a sacrament or a sermon. The shop isn't busy, and that's fine. I sell seeds, homemade teas, little bundles of herbs wrapped in twine. Enough to get by. Enough to breathe. Last week, a teenager came in, awkward, clutching a ratty backpack like it might fly away if she let go. She stood by the counter for a long time, biting her lip. Finally, she blurted, I want to grow chamomile. But I don't know how. Her words tumbled out fast, like she was embarrassed just for asking. I smiled, a real one, not the kind you wear like armor. I bent down behind the counter, rummaged through the seedlings, and pulled out the healthiest little pot I could find. Start with this, I said, handing it to her. It teaches you patience. She looked at the tiny plant like it was something sacred. Really? She whispered. Really, I said. Chamomile doesn't care if you know what you're doing. It just needs you to show up. She nodded, hugging the pot to her chest like it might slip away otherwise. Then she left, practically skipping down the sidewalk. I watched her go, then turned back to the sunlight spilling through the shop windows. I wasn't abundant. I wasn't anchoring a circle. I wasn't performing sacred generosity. I was just here. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.